Hello and welcome to Global Sri Lankan Forum, Canada Political Discussion, our talk show. Joining me today is Ruan Pereira, GSLF political analyst. Our topic today is History of Genocide and Sri Lanka in UNHRC. Sri Lanka is facing renewed version of resolution on the conduct of war against separatism. We have been held responsible for 40 to 75,000 civilian casualties during the last stages of the war, which ended in 2009. Apart from the accused war crimes, there have been implications even on genocide of minority Tamils in Sri Lanka. Under these circumstances, we thought about discussing the history of genocide and the status of the UNHRC resolution against Sri Lanka. So, Ruan, welcome to our program and glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, Shamal.
So, Ruan, my first question, as we know, the word genocide itself was a word that came around the mid 1940s, even though there are many instances of genocides that happened before 1940s around the world. Ruan, can you give us a brief history of genocide?
Yes, yes, Shamal.
Mhm.
Yes, as you said that the term genocide first appeared in late 1940s after the end of Second World War. Obviously, so there was the necessity to term it and then to create a framework to identify and react uh, in the global level to prevent the incidents such as the the genocide against the Jewish population in Germany. So we can describe it a little after.
Mhm.
And yes, so the genocide has been there throughout the history, but there weren't many documented occasions. But when you go through the history, you can see time to time certain things similar to genocide occurring during the wars, especially after the wars, right? So, for example, uh, we all know that there has been a huge empire called Mongol Empire. So these Mongols were ruthless in their conduct of war and feared by many nations. So they conquered almost the the countries in Europe and Asia, not all of them, but I would say like 70% of them, right? So during these wars, so they once they have defeated a certain country or a territory, they used to kill perhaps most of the male population and used to compile those heads in a manner which horrifies the local population. So
Mhm.
they thought that's necessary for their further advancements, right? That horror alone terrifies the next country which they were planning to occupy. So that was the method which they used, and that qualifies for genocide, I believe, right? Because but there was not a systematic elimination of certain
Mhm.
population, but rather it was a uh, tactic used to horrify the population, to subjugate them, right? But the same the same structure did not exist throughout the history. Yes. So we all know that there are certain rules in conducting wars in the modern history, right? But I believe that most of these structures appeared after the First World War, like the time period between First World War and the Second
Mhm.
World War. And there were certain rules existed even before, at the time of 18th century or even earlier wars in Europe and in other parts of the world, right? So there was certain amount of civility shown in those wars, right? Like in by the rulers who fought each other. Like for example, we can get examples from the Sri Lankan history and Indian history and European history. Right? For example, when King Dutugamnu in Sri Lanka fought
Mhm.
against King Elara in second century BC, so it is said that he erected a stupa to commemorate or to respect the fallen king, right? So even though it was necessary to defeat the enemy, so there was no um, there was no hesitation to respect his good qualities, right? So that was so. And when you go to India, like during the Emperor Ashoka's time, during the Mauryan Empire, so similar characteristics could be seen, right? So they almost denounced the war at a point, right? And then started a different version. So there were examples, because it's the human nature, right? So they sometimes uh, feel that it is devastating even thousands of years ago. Yes, so as explained, so there were times of genocides during the history, and there were times that wars were fought only between armies, and once an army was defeated, so uh, they were released with certain charging certain compensations or etc. So there were varying degree of civility in conducting wars throughout the history, but we do not see any structured rules until the 20th century, I believe. Yes, there were um, rules of honor even during at various times, but in the 19th century, or like especially in the 20th century, we can see the emergence of set of rules to be followed during the war, agreed by various nations. So they realized that uh, it would be better. So the wars were about testing, or the testing the powers of these nations, and to occupy based on that, right? So they decided that of course we can fight the wars to check the strength of these nations, and grant concessions or take concessions, but we can avoid these civilian casualties to a maximum extent, right? So especially the profession of nursing first appeared in a structured manner during the Crimean War in 1850s, the war between Russia and Russia on one side, and then Turkey or England and France on the other side, right? So with
Hmm.
all these things, so the humanity together, right? So the especially the countries which were leading at that time decided that okay, so let's have certain rules so we can avoid human casualties, and we can fight the war only between the armies, right? So once defeated, still if captured as prisoners of war, still they decided on certain rules and conduct afterwards, right? So to prevent atrocities, right? So so the country which win the war today could be could be defeated tomorrow, right? So this suits everybody well. Like in general, it suited humanity. So that's a brief history of genocide and the methods of conducting wars.
I see. Now, since you were talking about several genocides in the past, I just want to briefly mention about the called rubber terror, or the atrocities committed by the Belgians in 1885 to 1908 against the Congo Free State, where supposedly millions have been murdered, millions of civilians.
Yes, Shamal, true. Like I've heard about that too. So, and in general, during the period of colonizations, there must have been, there were hundreds of occasions where thousands of people were massacred. Like for example, Spanish colonized South America, right?
Hmm.
Especially the Inca and Aztec civilizations, right? So during those times, like when they conquered Mexico, it is said that there were 200,000 people in the 16th century in the city of Mexico, right? And during those wars, they were using firearms, and which did not exist in the New World back then.
Hmm.
So Spanish had a huge advantage over the local population, and they committed atrocities at will. And the very same thing happened in Peru, right? So when they were uh, conquering the Inca civilization, right? And throughout North America, right? And in North America as well, like throughout Americas and in North America also, right? Experience similar fate, right? So in North America, there we did not find very advanced civilizations.
Hmm.
Still, there were hundreds of tribes, like Indian or Red Indian tribes, right? So they were systematically we can say eliminated, but
Hmm.
it does not necessarily mean that they were massacred. But when the Western civilization was taking was spreading across America, so these tribes gradually became extinct, right? And few have survived, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the reality, right? But the very same powers which were responsible for these atrocities or systematic elimination of races have come up with certain rules late in 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now they are trying to impose their will on the countries, on all the other countries,
Other countries.
in conducting a war, even in within their boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Now, when going towards the genocide that was you mentioned earlier, that it was crafted. Not the word genocide was has come up during the late 40s. The most now in this case, how has this Holocaust redefined the term genocide? We know that was one of the most horrible periods in the history of the earth. So can you give a brief explanation to that, like as to how the Holocaust redefined the term genocide?
Yeah, yes, Shamal.
Hmm.
So Holocaust perhaps has perhaps been the single most memorable or the single most horrific experience the mankind has ever seen, right? Ever encountered. So it is the systematic elimination of Jewish people in Europe. So as we all know, so let me give you a brief history, right? So as we all know, Jewish people were scattered in the area of Middle East, like northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and they trace their history back to the periods to biblical times, right?
Hmm.
And later on, somehow they were expelled from these lands, but not by the Muslim population. That there weren't a Muslim population at that time. They
Hmm.
emerged very, I mean,
After.
at a later
Hmm.
century, right? Maybe 7, 8 centuries later, and they were scattered across North Africa and Europe, right? So by the beginning of 20th century, there was a huge Jewish population in present day Germany, right? And they were accused by Germans of betraying them in this First World War, right? And so there was accusation. So I'm
Hmm.
not sure if it was how far, how true it is, but there was accusation, right? So during the time, during the First World War. So at the same time, British had colonized the area of present day Palestine
Hmm.
and Israel, right? So it was under British Empire, right? So since it was under British Empire, I believe there was an existing Jewish population even by that time, right? And so under the British,
Hmm.
uh, the Jewish people from Europe were starting to settle down in the area, right? Because there it was under the British rule, and it was easier for another ethnic group to come and settle in modern day Israel area. It was called Palestine that at that time, right? So after the First World War, it is said that Britain and the Allied have promised a settlement in the inside the Palestine, British Palestine, right? So they were allowed to immigrate there, and then they gradually created their villages and cities, etc., and then became a sizable population by even by beginning of 1930s, right? So at that time, so uh, Germany was recovering from its losses in the First World War, and it was forced to pay reparations, like for initiating a war. So I believe that was the first time a reparation was uh, was imposed on a nation, on a defeated nation, in a systematic manner. So
Recorded.
Germany,
Hmm.
yes, yeah, in the recorded. So there were different way of,
Yeah.
like compensating for
In the history
initiating
of
a war
warfare.
by
Mm.
the yeah in the history of warfare by
Hmm.
the victorious party, and imposed on the defeated party, right? So it was
Yes.
could be sacking a city and
Hmm.
then looting, etc. But this was a different scenario. So Germany was asked to pay a certain amount of money each year. I'm not
Hmm.
sure the term, like the duration, but they have been paying for a few years, I believe, and then the country ended up in a huge inflation, a hyperinflation, along with the financial crisis in early 1930s, I think 1929 or so,
29,
right?
yes.
So resulted in a huge economic turmoil in Germany, right? And it helped the Nazi party to come into power. And Nazi party had this vision of eliminating or expelling Jewish people from Germany, right? So they
Hmm.
had even documented that in their book called Mein Kampf, right, written by Hitler and supported by Rudolf Hess, right?
Hmm.
So they were thinking of kicking out or expelling Jewish people at least from Germany, right? But as like so they came to power in 1933, the
Hmm.
Nazi party, and then they just uh, became a dictatorship right after that, even though they came through a democratic election, and they gradually started implementing their plans, right, of expelling Jews, right? So there were plans to settle them in the island called Madagascar, and
Hmm.
then they thought, like, it was after the war, but they thought that it would be nearly impossible because they wouldn't be able to bring them to the island, as the British Navy was powerful, right?
Hmm.
Even though Germany was very powerful in the land, British was still dominating the seas in the western half of
Hmm.
the world, right? And in Indian Ocean, right? So that was the scenario, and then somehow during the middle of the war, um, the final solution was spearheaded by Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler and
Hmm.
his supporter, uh, his subordinate, and they started sending them to concentration camps and put them in gas chambers, right? So during the Nuremberg trials, it was revealed by one of the accused military officer, there were 2.5 million deaths in one of the camps. I'm not sure
Wow.
if it was
Hmm.
Auschwitz or a different one, but that that German military officer, I think belonged to SS perhaps,
Hmm.
right, admitted that under his supervision, 2.5 million Jews were systematically eliminated, right? And so after that, the historian determined that the total death toll must have been closer to 6 million Jews, right?
Hmm.
So this was a very systematic killing, and set the prime example of the term genocide.
And but even though they were sent to the concentration camps, the systematic discrimination and grabbing their properties and their wealth was happening since the even sometimes before the war too, right? Before the start of the war.
Yes, Shamal. Yes, yeah,
Hmm.
that's true. Like, because there was a perception. So Jewish people were very entrepreneurial by
Hmm.
nature, right? They are more entrepreneurial than the local German population,
Hmm.
or many nations in Europe, right? So therefore, they used to run the businesses and used to accumulate wealth,
Hmm.
and more importantly, they used to lend money, right? And lend money for high interest rate, perhaps. Like,
Hmm.
I'm not sure how do you define the high, but that habit was not received well in Germany, and you can see it in the literature too, right? So when Shakespeare wrote his famous play, what is it called, the Merchant of Venice, right?
Hmm.
So that is sometimes called anti-Semitic, right? Because the villain is a Jewish merchant, right? And it is kind of written against his predatory practices. So somehow, so these are not considered to be wrong, considered to be wrong in modern uh, terms, but there was a sentiment, right? So that there was a sentiment, and then looting was kind of permitted, and it existed of true. But
Indeed. Hmm.
there were records that they were scared of the Jewish properties being looted because it
Mhm.
would harm the economy.
But whatever said and that, it's not anyway. There is no way it's justifiable as to what happened to them, even beginning from stealing their properties to making them go out of business to like burning their books or
Yeah.
scriptures, and that can be justified, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
of
that's
course. That's a horrific period.
period. So, Ron, I want to get back to now, the, we heard the term now, war crimes. What is the difference between war crimes and genocide, and are there any similarities between the two?
Yeah, I believe that when it
Mhm.
comes to a war crime, so it is usually referring to a crime conducted in the course of war. So
Mhm.
usually when two armies are fighting, so they are supposed to fight according to the modern norms, like established by the international bodies and
Mhm.
ratified by the respective nations, right? And being UN members, so they are supposed to conduct wars in under certain principles, right,
Mhm.
and guidelines, right. So, for example, like if two armies, like two armies of two countries are fighting, so they have to fight among the armed personnel only, right. So, if there
Mhm.
are civilians, so there has to be measures. There have to be measures to prevent um, them from being harmed, right, by the weapons, right, like so that's one thing. And again, when it comes to prisoners of war, so there are rules, right. So once you have taken someone prisoner, an army as prisoner, so they should be treated in a certain manner, right. They should be given foods and then shelter, and be released after some discussions between the two adversaries. So there are certain rules exist
Mhm.
in conducting wars, right? So if these are violated, right, especially when the wars are fought between a regular army and a guerrilla force, the chances of civilian casualties are high because the guerrilla forces usually hide among
The
the
civilians.
civilian
Mhm.
population, and it is very difficult to distinguish them, right?
Mhm.
So they can just change so they don't even appear in military uniform,
Yeah,
right?
some we have seen some LTE terrorists with uniforms and some without, so it's really hard to distinguish. I mean, if you shoot uh, an LTT terrorist and
Yeah, so
if you
you are
take away their
referring.
weapons, if they don't have the uniform, I mean, it can be called, that person can be called like a regular civilian versus a non-combatant, right?
Yes, exactly. So, and then the history of that person is very difficult to trace, right? So,
Hmm.
whether the person who died engaged in military training or terrorist work, right? In the past, it's very difficult, right? So, this United States faced this situation when they were fighting in Vietnam,
Hmm.
right? So they were fighting in 1960s and 70s, especially in 1960s and 70s, right? Even prior, but
Hmm.
during those 2 decades, the US was fighting a very ferocious war with the Viet Cong
Guerrillas, yeah.
guerrillas, right?
Hmm.
Like in southern Vietnam. So because northern Vietnam had become a communist state, and
Hmm.
then southern remained loyal to United States, right, as a
Yes,
democratic state, right? And but the northern Vietnamese, there were guerrillas in South Vietnam,
South Vietnam,
uh,
yes.
loyal to the north, and they
Hmm.
were fighting the US armies in the hope of unifying the country, right? So
Defend the
during
country.
that time, so US wanted to prevent it from occurring at any cost, and then they
Hmm.
send more than 500,000 forces to the country gradually, and then fought especially with the guerrillas, right? So
Hmm.
during those times, so there were hundreds of accusations on war crimes, right, committed during the guerrilla war, right? So they were jumping into a village and shooting them, like after an ambush, right? So
Something
ambush. Mhm.
notable is the My Lai massacre, if you can recall.
Oh yes.
Mhm.
Yes. So there were incidents that they massacred entire village, like
Mhm.
after being ambushed by the guerrillas, right? So in an ambush, a lot of soldiers die, and then the the friends of those soldiers are alive, and then
Mhm.
they want to revenge, right? So that's a
Yes,
human sentiment, right?
sentiment.
So when
Yes.
you're close to two of your closest friends just died, like because of an ambush, and then there is a village surrounding the area,
Hmm.
and people have a tendency to shoot around. But that must have been the case in Vietnam War, right?
Hmm.
But when it comes to war in Sri Lanka, I believe like the army took a very cautious
Approach for it,
approach,
yes.
yeah, towards the terrorists.
Even though we know that quite a few LTD terrorists managed to infiltrate the south wearing civilian clothing,
Yes,
and there were many attacks in temples or public places, and on our on some Sri Lankan leaders, against Sri Lankan leaders and even international leaders,
yeah,
uh, and they were not wearing uniform; they were wearing civilian clothing, right?
yes. So they were wearing civilian
Especially with the
clothing.
suicide attacks in the buses and public places.
Yes, yes. So it was like because in case of Sri Lanka, yeah, of course, 60% of the Tamil population lived among Sinhalese people in the south,
Peacefully.
and yes, yes, peacefully, right? So then, but the 100% of the terrorists were Tamils in their ethnicity, right? So it were ethnic Tamils, and then when they infiltrate into the south and conducted suicide bombings, it was very difficult to determine, right? So they were in civilian clothes, speaking Tamils, and it is very common in the south because there is a huge Tamil population, especially in the cities, right? So you can go without being suspected, right? Without being checked, right? So that was a very difficult situation which Sri Lanka faced during that time. And and yet Sri Lankan forces, I believe, uh, uh, was determined to fight the enemy face to face rather than aerial bombing, right? So that was a measure which Sri Lankan forces took to minimize the civilian casualties.
Minimize this.
Yes.
And also we can say like there were several reports done, especially mentioning Lieutenant Colonel Cash's report and Lord, which was actually talked by Lord Nasabi, and also taken, if you take a census in Jaffna or on the north and east, the populations have increased over the years, which
Yes.
in turn proves that there was no such vast genocide that they talk about.
Yes. 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 That's true. Yes.
I mean, even the reports that mention only to 5 to 7,000 civilian casualties in total, right?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. Especially General Gash's reports
Hmm.
are very important because he has stated that the casualties should be around 5 to 8,000, I
Hmm.
believe, right?
Yes.
And he was a military attaché to the British Council, like British High Commission
High
in Sri
Commission.
Lanka,
Yes.
right? So it's sad that the British government is ignoring reports from his their own officers and rely on the
Unsubstantiated.
unsubstantiated reports like the Usman report. So
Mhm.
that is an indication that the accusations leveled against Sri Lanka i- is based on political
Agendas.
agenda,
Mhm.
right? Right, rather than
Mhm.
on the records itself.
So, Ruan, at a glance, the UNHRC appears to represent universal humanitarian values and to protect them across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yet it is accused of violating sovereignty of nations in the process. And I have two questions. One, why are the and what is your view on this? And then why are allegations on Sri Lanka is flawed?
Yeah. So Shamal, so let me finish my
Mhm.
previous question, right,
Mhm.
about the similarities between war crimes and genocide. So when it comes to genocide, so genocide is a systematic elimination of an ethnic group or a
Mhm.
race, right? Like as our example about the genocide against Jewish people, the German regime at that time wanted to eliminate all of them from at least from Germany or even from Europe, right? So
Europe.
that
Mhm.
was a deliberation. That was a deliberately conducted act to expel them, right? From a land,
Mhm.
like clean a land from a certain clean. It's called ethnic cleansing. So to clean a certain wipe out a certain community from a certain geographic area, right? So that is genocide. So another recent example was the genocide in Rwanda. I think it was the genocide was aimed at wiping out the minority uh, community. I think they were Tutsis, right? So
Yes.
those are the two main incident I can recall, like which qualifies for the genocide. So
And
it's
even
very
the
different. Mhm.
Serbian
Yeah,
genocide
the
as well.
Serbian genocide, right? So in all these occasions,
Mhm.
the aim was to eliminate, right? So Sri Lankan armies never conducted that. So if they have to conduct, they don't have to go to
Mhm.
north because the
Yes,
60% of the Tamils live in the south, right?
exactly.
And among Sinhalese, right? But the LTTE did engage in ethnic cleansing, genocide,
Mhm.
right? So there were border areas where the majority is Tamil and the minority is Sinhalese, right?
Mhm.
So they systematically uh, engaged in ethnic cleansing
Mhm.
by getting into a village
Mhm.
in the night and killing villagers. Sometimes they killed between 20 to 150 people, right? So there were around 150 incidents recorded during since 1983 till the end of the war. So that qualifies for ethnic
Mhm.
cleansing. So if you check the villages which they committed, which they killed, so they are all in the border areas between their mythical homeland
Mhm.
and the Sinhalese majority area. So that qualifies for ethnic cleansing, and it's sad that the Western nations, which accuses the state of Sri Lanka for committing atrocities,
Atrocities.
um, turn a blind eye on these.
Mhm. So yeah, man. As we mentioned, yeah. So my next question is the one that I mentioned to you earlier. So why are the allegations on Sri Lanka or on all these genocide is flawed, and as I mentioned earlier, again, at a glance, UNHRC appears to represent universal humanitarian values and to protect them across the globe. So yet, I mean, they are still accusing us of they are still accused of violating the sovereignty of nations in the process. So, what is your view on this?
Yes, Shamal. So I believe like the everybody believes, right? Like most of the Sri Lankans believe that the allegations leveled against Sri Lanka by UNHRC are flawed,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, right? Because there are records by Sri Lankan government and the foreign officials of the amount of number of casualties occurred during the latter stage of the war, right? Last stages of the war. So it is estimated between 5,000 to 8,000. And if you compare the population of the land, I believe nearly 400,000 or 500,000 maximum lived in that northern area, northern provinces. You can believe that it is matching with the existing population. The population existed at that time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And as we discussed before, the records, the reports from Mr. Gash, right, who was a military attaché to the British High Commission, proves the same, right? So instead of relying on those reports, the UNHRC relies on the report initiated by Darusman.
Mm-hmm.
He's said to be a personal, a private, like someone who worked for the General Secretary of the United Nations at that time, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, right? So he has appointed him, and he came up with the number of arbitrary number of 40,000, right? So then the number increased to 75,000, and in certain cases, some of the separatists who still live in the West claim 146,000 deaths. Right? These are all the baseless numbers, right? So without a proper basis.
Now,
And
one,
when it comes to like as you ask me, like, yes, of course the UNHRC represents
mhm,
humanitarian values, right? I believe that, like, after the especially after the Second World War, so the necessity to protect human rights became became a concern for all the countries, like especially after the experience with the Nazi regime and the Imperial Japanese army, right? So they also committed crimes in all their territories, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
does not exclude the other colonial powers from
Mm-hmm.
similar atrocities, right? But these were huge and very visible, right? So then there was a true necessity to establish human rights across the world, right? So that there is no question about that, right? So but in implementing those, so you can see some asymmetry, right? So these are
Mm-hmm.
not um, imposed on the powerful countries,
Mm-hmm.
but by the powerful countries on weaker countries when they are not in line with their political agenda. So
Impartial, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yes, exactly. That's why we say they are flawed.
Mm-hmm. Right now,
And the
mm-hmm.
and about the sovereignty, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so yes, of course, Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation, and so is many other, so are the other countries, right?
Yes.
But when the UNHRC or any other international institution try to impose their will on another country, right? Like try to criticize the uh, laws approved, or like laws approved by
Mm-hmm.
the local elected officials. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a violation of sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
Yes, so of course, right? So we can see similar attempts even in the latest resolution, which is under consideration now, right? So you can see that they have
Mm-hmm.
accused Sri Lankan government for having military officers,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like ex-military officers in civil service,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's so the military officers were hired by the government, which got the majority in the last election. They got 2/3, right? Majority, right? So, but then it was a democratic process, and then they can appoint any officer they need, right? So these are not current military officers; they were ex-military officers, right? So that's a clear violation of sovereignty.
And also, Sri Lanka has been a democracy since our independence in 1948.
Yes. Exactly. So we have been
So,
a democracy.
mm-hmm.
We have never been
Mm-hmm.
Sri Lanka has never been under a military government,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a plus, right? But still
Exactly.
they accuses us and try to. So that's an area where UNHRC or any other UN body needs to improve, I believe, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
of course, it is very necessary to prevent a genocide as happened in Germany or in Rwanda or in
Mm-hmm.
Serbia, right? So therefore, they should be working constantly with the nations across the globe to prevent such an incident, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they should not lose their credibility by uh, moving forward with political agendas, right?
Yes.
And violating the sovereignty, right? If there is an elected government, a democratically elected government, so instead of writing reports based on the minority or of that country which is seeking a separate state, they should visit the country and
Mm-hmm.
do a thorough research before writing a report against a country, right? Because by doing so, they lose their credibility,
Credibility.
right? So if when they lose their credibility, the very same values which they try to protect uh, will not be protected.
Right. And so now talking about the UNHRC, there is a vote that's going to happen in the next few days or week or so, against Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Uh, would be would we be able to defeat the resolution against Sri Lanka, and if so, at what cost, and what is the impact of the position of India on this in this case?
Yes, Shamal. So it is under. So they brought the resolution against Sri Lanka last month, and we have been lobbying
Hmm.
the member state uh, to vote in our favor, and
Hmm.
the core countries, right? So core
Yes.
countries of UK, Germany, France,
Hmm.
and Canada, I believe, right, and few other countries. So they were lobbying the member state to vote in favor of the resolution. That means vote against Sri Lanka, right?
Hmm.
So it was revealed last week that there are around 20 countries or 21 countries which spoke in support of Sri Lanka, but not
Hmm.
all of them are UN not all of them are members of the UNHRC, right? So at the
Yes.
same time, around 10 countries voiced against Sri Lanka, right? So it is, and India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, I think their vote in favor of Sri Lanka is not yet guaranteed, like not
Mm-hmm.
yet confirmed, right? But it is said that the Indian vote is very crucial, right? So it's not because uh, I mean, it's not about their single vote, right? So it is said that if India votes in favor of Sri Lanka, so there are few other countries who would get on board and vote in favor of Sri Lanka, right? So there is a
Mm-hmm.
likelihood that we could win this one, like we
Mm-hmm.
could get the majority states to vote in our favor, and we believe so. Like we wish it would happen.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, so we have, like, Sri Lankan government is making a huge effort to convince the member state, right? So in case of convincing India, so it has become very difficult, right? So
Mm-hmm.
because uh, in exchange for their vote and the vote from other few countries which would vote because of India, and there has been few demands, right?
Mm-hmm.
From India, right? So one such demand is to conduct the provincial council elections. So they don't say that they are asking this because of their vote, right? But it is very evident, right? So they want us to continue with provincial councils and to hold provincial council elections, etc., right? And so similar concessions are sought by some other nations too, right? So they try to represent minorities in Sri Lanka, which is a clear violation of our sovereignty by them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we are facing that. So Sri Lankan government should analyze these proposals very carefully
Mm-hmm.
and see if the concessions being granted, right, worth the vote or few votes which we get, right? So we might end up losing it anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if we lose because of not giving away those concessions which they are seeking, we would still be better off, right? Rather than winning
Mm-hmm.
by giving a lot of concessions. For example,
Concession.
if provincial councils are not if majority of the population decides that provincial councils are not necessary, we shouldn't hold elections or continue with them just because of the pressure from another state,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or just because they are extending us the support in UNHRC. Yes, so that's my
Mm-hmm.
view on that.
So,
And
so basically, now what you're saying is we may have would we have we might have to pay a high price to win India's support. So it's not worth it. Is that what you're saying? And is it too costly for us? Or
yes, it may be too costly, right? So we cannot
mm-hmm.
still determine that, like if it is costly or not. But that's why, like, the government need to analyze it very carefully, right? So what is the
Mm-hmm.
degree of support which we get from India, and how many states would
How many
vote
states?
in our favor because of India, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the concessions which they are asking, right? So there are plans even to establish a branch of BJP or a
Mm-hmm.
mirror image of BJP in Sri Lanka, right? So if they establish that, they would be working according to the will of another nation,
Other
right? So it
nation,
would be very
yes.
difficult for us to remain as an independent nation, right? So we shouldn't be hesitant to 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 ban those parties, even
Mm-hmm.
if we lose the vote of India or the other few states which would follow them, right? So that these are the things that we need to analyze carefully and come up with the proper
Solution.
answer,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, answer and a solution, right? Because so we just cannot make continuous attempt to win the votes in UNHRC
Mm-hmm.
by allowing so many concessions.
Yes, and even though the Indians, some of the media units in India have denied any direct involvement from the BJP party to the BJP party in Sri Lanka, So you're still saying they should be controlled to an extent, or it should be banned completely. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes, I believe that they should be banned, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if you imply some ties to a party in a
Mm-hmm.
political party in a different state, right? So that's a clear violation of sovereignty of Sri Lanka,
Mm-hmm.
and they should those parties should be banned right away, right? Because yes, India wouldn't, India would claim that there is no relationship or they don't have any aspirations,
Mm-hmm.
but it is very clear from the recent discussions that a party has been established under that
Mm-hmm.
name, and they claim that there is no relationship to India, but um, but they but it is very clear that their intention it is to gather the Tamil minority, perhaps Muslim minority as well, under the banner of BJP Sri Lanka, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if it happens, right, Sri Lanka will face a very difficult situation
Very difficult situation.
dealing with the consequences.
Consequences. So, Ruan, thank you for partaking in our second round of discussions on history with GSLF, representing GSLF. So, we discussed today history of genocide and Sri Lanka in UNHRC. Thank you very much for participating, and I wish you a good night and cheers.
Yes, thanks, Shamal, for having me.
You're welcome.